Brother Raul?
All right, let's dive right into this. We're going to be learning a lot about Noah's Ark today. First, we're going to start with the evidence for Noah's Ark, and then we're going to take a look at a possible flood model that explains what the world looks like. And this is rather appropriate right now because just last week or two I was talking to an evolutionist and I asked him, well, what's the best evidence for evolution? And he said the fossils. And I said, the fossils? Is that dead deer on the side of the road? Is that going to turn into a fossil? And he says, I said, it's going to get scavenged and it's going to decompose. And he said, right. You need a special conditions to make a fossil. And I said, exactly. They need for something to get turned into a fossil, it needs to be buried rapidly. You know, it needs to be buried rapidly. And I said, what makes fossils all over the world that's buried rapidly? I said, points to a worldwide flood. And he said, well, it could be mudslides. Lots and lots of mudslides. And I said, well, you can have all the mudslides you want, but how do you get clams and marine fossils mixed with the land fossils in a mudslide? It doesn't work. And I said that, you know, if the fossil has to be buried rapidly to become a fossil, that means any layer that has fossils in it was laid down rapidly. And that's the whole geologic column. And so, but he actually confirmed what the Bible has to say. This is 2 Peter 3. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers walking after their own lusts. Has anybody met any scoffers before? Scoffing at the Bible? Yeah, well, they're just fulfilling the Bible. The Bible said they'd come. So if they scoff, you can say you just validated the Bible. The Bible said you'd be here. And saying, where's the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. And so that's that uniformitarian mindset. It's all that's, you know, these are the only processes that we can use right now. For this they willingly are ignorant of. That's dumb on purpose. Willingly ignorant of that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. So the Bible said that there'd be people that are going to be willingly ignorant of creation and willingly ignorant of the flood. And so let's take a look at some evidence for the flood. And I spoke on Wednesday night at Sparta. And this Bruce Kaufman, he's a fossil hunter. He just loves hunting fossils. And so he invited me on Thursday to come and look at his place. And it's like a museum. He had fossils of all kinds, and he was saying all these big words that I didn't know what they meant, and he just went on. And all these fossils are a sign of God's judgment. I spent an hour. He was showing me. He was explaining. There's a shark tooth, and that finger is where how big those shark teeth can get. And it just goes on and on. All these different types. And I asked him, are those baby starfish? And he said, no, they grow in a column. You see that black column in that box? He says that's how they grow. And it was just all this stuff. And it's just, and then there was you find these, I forget what they call them, but they're these rocks. And inside, they look like this. And so what they do is they find them and they put them in a bucket of water for the winter. And then they crack open by themselves. Just amazing. And he gave me a bunch of fossils. I put his card and these fossils in the back. So if you guys want to learn about fossil, man, he just loves to talk about fossils. And a lot of these were right next to where we were at the Bible camp. And if you look there's some clams in there, and it just screams loudly of a worldwide flood. And then he has them all around his outside too. And I've got one of those. Yeah, that's right here. He gave me a couple. This is fossil algae. And it's rounded on top, and it's all these layers in the middle, and it's pushed up on the bottom. He had some fancy word for it, but this is what he found in limestone. And then he found the same thing that was more of a crystalline rock. He found that, or silica-based rock. It's a lot harder than this, but he found the harder rock above the softer rock, which was hard to explain from their perspective. And so I'll have these on the back. Feel free to, you see those signs that say don't touch? It's like, no, feel free to touch them. Pick them up. See how old they are. And he also gave me this fossil clam, and I'd been looking for these for a decade or two. A nice big one like this, and it's in the closed position. Anybody ever seen a dead clam? What do? They open up, that's right. So when you find a dead clam in the closed position, he says that's how they normally are, then that means they were buried alive. And they're all over the place. And this was an interesting fossil. You see that black hole on the left? You can see what it did. It burrowed down into all those layers. How do you do that if all those layers are millions of years or even thousands of years old? So whatever it was burrowed down there through all of those layers. So that would be a polystrate fossil. That's many layers with one fossil remnant. And this is the most important fossil, I think. It was a thorn, fossil thorns. This is a fossil thorn in coal. And we'll talk about that at the end. But let's talk about this Noah's flood. I mean, was there really a worldwide flood on Earth? Well, there's people that think there was a worldwide flood on Mars, and there's no liquid water there. And it says this activity was at least a regional and possibly global. That's from space.com. You know, when I'm going to put together a talk, I go into rsr.org and I see what they have to say. I listen to the radio interview, and then I go through all their sources. I mean, it's just a gold mine of information. And then the other place I went is Answers in Genesis. They had like 8 reasons for a global flood. And so people will say, well, if there was a global flood on Earth, hey, where'd all the water go? Well, let's figure out how much water there is. How deep is the ocean? 12,000 feet. It's 2 miles deep on average. So that's a lot of water. Well, how high is the elevation of Earth on the continents? And it took me a while to find this one, but I found it in National Geographic. And it says land mass's average elevation above sea level is about 2,700 feet. So you got 2,700 feet of land sticking above the ocean, and yet the oceans are 12,000 feet. So if you push up the oceans, push down the land, the mountains, you're going to have roughly, you know, a mile and a half of water over everything. And so yeah, there's plenty of water here. You know, you got the highest point is Mount Everest, 29,000 feet. Well, the deepest point on Earth is the Mariana Trench, which is a mile deeper. There's plenty of water to flood the Earth. And then this is New Scientist. It says early Earth was covered in a global ocean and had no mountains. So they're saying there was a global flood. And I'm not sure exactly how they figured that out, but they were analyzing the zircons. And they say sediment melting is characteristic of major continent collisions, such as the Himalayas. So it appears that such events did not occur in the early stages. So they're saying there was a worldwide flood. But it brings up sedimentary rock. And I always wondered, where did all this sediment come to make the rocks? Encyclopedia Britannica says that they're made by weathering pre-existing rocks. And I'm going to say no, I think they were made when the fountains of the Great Deep broke up, and we'll talk about that next hour. But Answers in Genesis, they got bullet points. This is the main reason they have for the global flood. Marine fossils high on mountains. Now, I'm not a scientist, so I'll just read you what the scientists say. That way I don't mess it up. And it says, we don't find marine creatures such as fish, clams, and corals buried and fossilized on the seafloor where they once lived. Instead, we find most of them buried in sedimentary rocks on the continents, even on high mountains. For that to happen, the ocean waters had to totally flood the continents. And they're saying, well, how could you have water over Mount Everest? Well, I'm not saying water was over Mount Everest. I'm saying Mount Everest was under the water. That's a difference. You know, the Mount Everest wasn't there before the flood. And it goes on to say we find ammonite fossils, that's squids with coil shells, and limestone layers high up on the Himalayas in Nepal near the top of Mount Everest. Yeah, and so also they find them in Grand Canyon, over 2,900 feet above sea level. So let's take a look at what NASA has to say about Mount Everest. It says the presence of limestone and ocean marine fossils at the top of these mountains is one of the key pieces of evidence for a global flood? No. They say they advance the idea of plate tectonics. So plate tectonics is a secular model trying to explain how marine fossils got up there, and a lot of our creation organizations just take that model and speed it up. It's kind of like theistic evolution. They take a secular model and they slap a cross on it and say, see what God did. You know, I think there's a different model that explains it better, and we'll talk about that next hour. Well, what else do they find near the top? And there's whales on mountaintops. It's like, whoa, that's a big fossil on a mountaintop. And I was so excited to show you this, and it didn't really tell you much in that article, so I knew it was in Chile. And I searched it, and they found fossil whale graveyard explained. And they're upside down, oriented in the same direction, so they say they died out at sea. And they got this Cerro Ballena fact sheet, that's Whale Hill, and it says that there are 10 different kinds of marine vertebrates preserved in 4 separate layers. And it goes on to say there was 40 baleen whales that were there. But it didn't tell me how high it was. And so I went in and they showed a picture, and you can kind of see it, the sea in the background. It's like, well, that's not very high. That doesn't look like a mountaintop. And so I go into this elevation tool. This is en-us.topographic/map.com. And you can click anywhere in the world and it'll give you the elevation. And so how they found these whales was they were building this road. They were making it wider, and they found these whale fossils. And they said, okay, you got 2 weeks to document it, and then the road's going through. So they got 2 weeks. So I knew it was by the road, and I figured that's the road, and it's either 104 feet or 186 feet. But that's not a mountaintop. So I went back into Real Science Radio, and Bob Hadnard had it clicked. He had a link to the whales on mountaintops, and there it was. New York Times. Whale fossils high in the Andes. How high? It was fossils of marine animals. It was 5,000 feet. So it's almost a mile above sea level. Whales. How do they explain that? Okay, their second best reason was massive fossil graveyards around the world. And these graveyards include land animals and marine animals. How do you get that in a mudslide? It screams loudly for a worldwide flood. What does it mean? Why are the fossil graveyards important evidence for a flood? It shows rapid burial, massive proportions all around the world, unusual sediment too. Because are those sand dunes turning into sandstone? No, they have to be mixed with a cementing agent. And that happened in the worldwide flood, and we'll talk about that. And then there's a wide variety of creatures and marine and land animals, and they're found at all levels of the fossil record all over the world. So all of those layers were laid down rapidly, not over millions of years. And this is the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. They said there was a mass extinction. 90% of all the marine species went extinct at one time. And I think that was during the flood. And I'm talking to the oil guy, and he's talking about that when the gushers come up, it can make a sonic boom. And I asked him, would that sonic boom kill these whales? And he said, if they were right next to it, it would. But if they were farther away, it probably wouldn't. And then we showed you one of those polystrate fossils. You can listen to a radio interview on Real Science Radio, and they find perch and tadpoles and jellyfish. Normally they show the trees, but they also find vertical leaves. A vertical leaf, is that going to balance there for millions of years for the sediment to go up? No. And also whales and other whales. And this polystrate, that's kind of key for geology. But yet the geology books don't mention polystrate at all. They searched the top 10 science geology books, and they wasn't mentioned once. So they just want people to assume that they were laid down millions of years, and if there's any evidence that shows that it's not millions of years, they just won't talk about it. And that's what our job is. Our job is to talk about it. If they aren't going to, we have to. And then they find exquisitely preserved fossils. In the South Australia, they found thousands of jellyfish that are impeccably preserved in this sandstone bed. This is significant because soft-bedded creatures like jellyfish that wash onto a beach today melt in the sun or are destroyed by crashing waves. And that's what we're holding there. We got a jellyfish and a frisbee. And at ICR down in Dallas, they bought the fossil jellyfish because Darwin said it couldn't happen. He said only hard things can fossilize. And then they also found a bunch of fossils in a quarry in Wisconsin. And so it says at least in 7 thin layers, they contain impressions left by thousands of jellyfish stranded on what was a tropical beach about 495 million years ago. Is Wisconsin a tropical beach? Separate the facts from the fiction. You can observe the jellyfish there in 7 different layers. That's a fact. It being a tropical beach, that's an interpretation of the fact. So separate those two. And also they found a massive sand grains provided a hint to the animal's stomach. Well, I think the wave hit with such force, it just pushed sand anywhere. And I don't know if you've ever been inside of a big wave getting pushed around. Anybody? I was boogie boarding out in Hawaii one time, and I was up there, and all of a sudden I did a nosedive into the sand. I just hit boom, and thank God I fell flat instead of bending over. And I had a second to think, where'd all the water go? And it hit me like a ton of bricks. It just boom, just pounded me into the surf, And I just kind of after it went by, I got up and I moved everything. I was like, well, I'm still working. Looked at my wife and she's laughing on the beach. And then half an hour later, we're at McDonald's and I bend down and water comes out of my ears. So that it just, they're pretty forceful. And number 4 is sediment spread across continents. And many of these sediments can reach all the way across continents and all the way around the world. Anybody been to Grand Canyon? Those layers just don't stop there. Some of those go all the way across the continent. And not only that, they go all across the world. And it's just amazing. And this Tim Clary, he's done a lot of research looking at those boreholes. There's thousands of boreholes, and it all gets documented, and he's going through it, and he works for ICR, and he's doing a great work. This is from the Answers in Genesis article. It says, you know, those cliffs of Dover and Normandy, those are chalk cliffs. And it says these same chalk beds can be traced across France, the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, southern Scandinavia, and other parts of Europe to Turkey, then to Israel and Egypt, and as far as Kazakhstan. And it said, remarkably, these same chalk beds with the same fossils and the same distinctive layers above and below them are also found from Nebraska to Texas and from Alabama and Arkansas to Colorado. And they also appear in Australia. That's one worldwide flood to lay down all those layers at the same place in the same time. It just screams worldwide flood. And anybody who says, oh, it's a bunch of local floods, that can't happen locally. That's not going to happen. And it says that Tapete sandstone covers much of the U.S. and parts of Canada and Greenland, but it can also be traced across Africa and beyond to Israel, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. So another layer that's worldwide. And these layers were laid down like pancakes, one on top of the other. So it's a worldwide flood. Number 5 is features of the sedimentary layers. And they find huge boulders at the bottom of the Tapete sandstone. Huge boulders means that it was really powerful to move those boulders. And then it's still in the sand, so it wasn't slow, because if it was slow, all that sand would erode away. And then no signs of millions of years between the layers. And Bob Enyart, he's one of my heroes, actually. He was really bold, you know, really bold. He'll call up evolutionists and ask them, he'll be in the midst of all this controversy. And what did he do? He burned O.J. Simpson's jersey and Hall of Fame thing on the courthouse of the Los Angeles courthouse. And they went in to get a permit. Doug McBurney went in to get a permit, and he said, yeah, we'd like to burn something on the courthouse steps tomorrow. And normally it takes weeks, if not months. And the guy says, well, what do you want to burn? He said, OJ's Hall of, his jersey and something else. And they said, the judge said, oh, I'll sign it right here. But that's what Bob Enyart will do, you know. And so there he is, and he's been to the Grand Canyon dozens of times. And he loves to talk to the tourists and say, you know, what features there? Do you see the flat layers there? And they go, yeah. And he goes, well, if they're laid down over millions of years, where's the erosion? Wouldn't it rain once in a while? And so there's no erosion. It's just knife edge, like somebody just laid down. This is in Utah, just perfectly flat. And then also, in the Grand Canyon, you got the Hermit Formation, and then right on top is the Coconino Sandstone, right there. Nothing in between them. And Answers in Genesis says the boundary between the Coconino Sandstone and the Hermit Formation is flat, featureless, and knife-edged from one end of the canyon to the other. But 70 miles away, it's almost 2,000 feet of sandstone, shale, and limestone in the Schnebly Hill Formation sit on top of the Hermit Formation. So just think of the Coconino and the Hermit as two pieces of bread in the Grand Canyon. But 70 miles away, you got this whopper right in between them. You know, the Schnebly Hill Formation, almost 2,000 feet thick. So they clearly could not have been put down over millions of years. Could not have. There's no way. It's a sign of a flood. And then they're also missing millions of years between two of the layers. I do a whole nother talk on the Grand Canyon. Number 7, the folds we find in these layers of sediment. See, there's rock that's bent at a 90-degree angle, and they're not cracked. They're just bent. And the only way that's going to happen is if they're mud that gets bent and then they turn to rock. They can't be rock and get bent. And you can do an experiment at home. Just take your finest piece of china and bend it. See what happens. And see if it matters if you bend it slowly, you know, or quickly. You know, it's going to break, just like the rocks. They'll say, well, if you heat them up, you can make pressure, and you know, you can bend them with heat, but that's going to cause the rock to change, and we would be able to tell. And also they find fossil footprints millions of years before the creature that made them. Yeah, they find no fossilized body parts of the animal responsible for making the footprints, and yet they find that organism, you know, 50 million years later. There's flood legends all over the world. How come there'd be flood legends all over the world unless there was a worldwide flood? Unless they experienced it on Noah's Ark and then they got handed down as legends. And then the Tower of Babel, they got all over the world, but the same legend is there. And they've got a lot of similarities. This on creation.com, it says there's at least 500 legends of worldwide flood. And that's the first time I've seen 500. Normally it's like 200 or 300 legends. But let's take a look at some of them. And that's what I get at college. Oh, the Bible just copied itself from the Mesopotamian text. That's what they'll say. But they'll bring up Gilgamesh because there was a worldwide flood, and that story was supposed to be written before the Bible. And in the Gilgamesh it says, tear down your house and build a boat, and take up into the boat the seed of all living creatures. Each side of the deck measured 120 cubits, making a square boat. That's not seaworthy. But the ark in the Bible, that's 300 cubits by 50 cubits. That's a 6-to-1 ratio, and that's what they make the battleships out of. That's what they make the barges. That's the dimensions of that. So the Bible ark is seaworthy. Gilgamesh is a square, and you'd just be rolling around. You'd be on your head and on your feet and on your head. It wouldn't work. And then the ancient Chinese, they had one where the sun, moon, and stars changed their motions. And I think that happened during the flood. It changed up the clock. And the earth fell to pieces, and the waters in its bosom rushed upwards with violence and overflowed the earth. So waters from inside rushed upwards. That's noteworthy. Okay, and then in Peru, they said that the waters rose above the highest mountains in the world, so that all the people and all created things perished. No living thing escaped except a man and a woman, who floated in a box on the face of the waters, and so were saved. So that's real close to what the Bible says. In Scandinavia, this one, I think, after we go through the talk next hour, this one's really going to make a lot of sense. But it says, the mountains crumbled or split from top to bottom. Men were driven from their hearths, and the human race was swept from the surface of the earth. The earth itself was beginning to lose its shape. Already the stars were coming adrift from the sky and falling into the gaping void. Flames spurted from the fissures in the rocks. Everywhere there was hissing of steam. So flames and steam. That's important. All living things, all plant life were blotted out. And now all the rivers and all the seas rose and overflowed. From every side waves lashed against waves. They swelled and boiled and slowly covered all things. The earth sank beneath the sea. Then slowly the earth emerged from the waves. Mountains rose anew. Now this is the best description I've heard of that flood. And that's Scandinavian. Also in the Australian Aborigines, before any missionaries got there, they had a story. The Supreme Being said, if you want to live, take your wife and your sons' wives and get in a double raft, because the Dumini affair, I intend to drown everyone. So something bad happened, and he's going to drown everyone. And then into whirled the flood waters, and the earth opened, drowning and flattening them all. And then it goes on to say, the Supreme Being put the rainbow in the sky to keep the rain clouds back. The rainbow protected us so that the rainfall does not rise too high. So they've got a lot of elements from the Bible. And what does the Bible say? In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. It just blew. And people will say that Genesis is an allegory or poetic or what else do they, a framework. It's like, does that look like poetry? Does that look like an analogy? That's history. It's describing a historical event. It's going out of the way. It's when? In the 600th year, in the second month, the 17th day of the month. That's history. That's not an analogy or an allegory. And then people say, well, it was just a local flood. Well, if it was just a local flood, why did birds have to be on the ark? They can just fly away. Why didn't God just tell Noah, hey, just move to the other side. Where there's a flood coming here, why don't you move? But that wasn't the intent of the flood. The flood was to judge everyone. God judged sins, and these fossils are an evidence of that. And for them to say it's a local flood, I wonder how they interpret this. This is from Genesis 7. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. And some say, well, they were just covered with rain. But that's not what the word means there. I heard somebody say, no, it means buried in water. And to hide it, like you can see a mountain that's covered in rain, but you can't see it if it's covered in water. Okay, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, and all that was on dry land died. Dry land, all over the world, died. And Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. But if you can get rid of the worldwide flood, now you really cast a lot of doubt on the New Testament writers, and even Jesus, when he said, this is Luke 17, they did eat, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. All, not just that region, all. And 2 Peter, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing the flood upon the world. Not the region, the world. This is from Matthew 24, and it's similar to Luke. But as the days of Noah were, and it goes down, and they knew not until the flood came and took them all away. And then 1 Peter 3, which sometimes were disobedient when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was preparing, wherein a few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. And that's an interesting way to phrase it. 8 souls were saved by water. The water saved them. So it kind of makes me wonder if, the world was evil continually, the imagination of the hearts of man was evil continually before the flood, and it repented God that he had made it. Amen. Maybe it was so evil that those people were going to kill Noah and his family, and the water saved them. That's just one, I'm not a Bible scholar, but that's just like, they were saved by water. When I was putting this talk together, I thought, well, that's an interesting way to phrase it. They were saved by the flood. Interesting. And then Isaiah 54:9 even talks about it. For this is as the waters of Noah unto me, for as I have sworn that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth, so I have sworn that I would not be wroth with thee nor rebuke thee. So God said he's never going to flood the earth again. And that's why we got the rainbow. I do set my bow on the cloud, and it shall be for a token, a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass that when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. So it's a worldwide flood. And there's been a whole, and if it's a local flood, God's a liar, because he said he'd never do it again. There's been a lot of local floods, but never a worldwide flood. And it's interesting too, the Chinese character. This is their symbol for boat. And it's actually, you break it into pieces, and it's vessel 8 people. Why 8? Fred Williams was given this talk, and he said that's 8. And somebody came up to him who had lived in China and said, that's not the symbol for 8. He goes, oh, really? And so I'll check it out, he says. And he was working for somebody who grew up in China. And he goes, and he said, is that the symbol for 8? And she said, no, but it used to be. So their language has kind of changed, but that's the old symbol for 8. So vessel 8 plus people equals boat. And to covet or desire is 2 trees, a woman. And then also to create is to speak, dust, life, walk. All these things are pointing back to Genesis. And to complete and finish is 2 plus persons equals first. And then first plus home equals complete. Because God said it is very good. And then forbidden and to warn, that's 2 trees and then God. So why 2 trees? Knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. And then garden. This is interesting. Dust plus breath plus 2 people plus enclosure equals garden. So their symbols are telling the Genesis story. And then the tempter. That's secret plus man plus garden plus alive equals devil. Devil plus trees plus cover equals tempter. And you know what they found in China? They found a bronze tree. Yeah, bronze tree, and it's that's what it looks like, a large tree, which is unusual among ancient bronze artifacts. And you can see this article in creation.com. And it's a life-size tree with a life-size fruit. And it'd be interesting to see what fruit they put there. And then the leaves had shapes of long knives, like forbidden. And the serpent has feet. And then the knife, and it had a knife-like tail, like it was evil. And then there's a human hand. So if you look at where the arrows are pointing, on that part of the tree, there's a hand, and then it zooms in on it to the right there. But there's the tree. There's the leaves with knives, shaped like knives, like a forbidden fruit. And it looks like a round fruit. I'm not sure what that is. And then the snake, if you look at the very bottom, he's got feet. Remember that was one of the consequences of sin? That he's going to crawl on his belly. And then during the 14 years before Taoists and the Buddhists, the ancient Chinese never made an image of Shangtai, the self-existent. He existed before the heaven, the earth, the sun. He created them. His years have no end. So that's what the Chinese believed a long time ago. And that's from a book called Discovery of Genesis. That's where a lot of those symbols came from. And this is the thorn. Remember that? The fossil thorn in coal. Why is that significant? Because that's a consequence of sin. Those layers were laid down after the fall. In Genesis 3:18 it says, "Cursed be the ground for thy sake, and sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, and thou shalt return to the dust. Thou was taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return." And that's the scientific statement true. That's true. And so then the Bible talks about science. It's true. And Bob Enyart, he talks to all these guys, and there's some from the Discovery Institute. They're good at intelligent design arguments, but they believe in a long earth. And one of the guys that, and they went on this cruise with those guys, and they'd ask them about the dinosaur blood and dinosaur fossils. They found dinosaur blood and dinosaur bone. And the scientists would just drop. They'd say, "I've never heard of it." So then he'd pull it up on his phone, and their jaws would drop to the ground because dinosaur blood can't last millions of years. And they find nerves in it now. Nerves can't last millions of years. Therefore, dinosaurs are not millions of years old. And then he was talking to one of those scientists, and the scientist who's a Christian, but he believes in a long earth, he says, "Well, Bob, what do you believe that I don't believe? Or what do you believe that I don't believe?" And Bob said that thorns are a consequence of sin, because thorns are in the fossil record. You believe that thorns came before sin. And that the age of the earth is very, very important because it shows who's responsible for death. If you believe that there was millions of years of death before the fall, then God's responsible. He's the one who used it. But if you believe that man messed it up, brought death into the world because of their sin, now we're responsible. And that's why Jesus came to die on the cross, because we messed it up and he's going to fix it. And when you believe in millions of years, it's like, well, then why did Jesus come? Okay, so let's wrap this up real quick. 2 Peter 3:3. We're going to continue. Okay, we're going to start. "Knowing this first, there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, Where's the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. And for this they willingly are ignorant of, that the word of God, and the heavens that were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was being overflowed with water perished." Okay, so what does that mean to us? It says, "But the heavens and the earth, which are now by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of godly men." So there's another judgment coming. It's going to be by fire this time, and you don't want to be in it. And it says, "Beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day with the Lord is as 1,000 years." And that's what you hear all the time. Well, a day is like 1,000 years. Well, it doesn't say millions or billions when they try to say each day was millions or billions. It says thousands, but then it goes on to say, "and 1,000 years as one day." So it's basically God's outside of time. And the Lord is not slacking concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And then it comes to our big bang. They believe in a big bang in the past. There's a big bang coming right now. And it says, "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in the which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise." That's a big bang. "And the elements shall melt with fervent heat, and the earth also with the works that are therein shall be burned up." So, and that reminds me of that one. We're going to get rewarded for what we do. What's done for Jesus, we're going to get gold, silver, precious stones, and whatever's done that's not for Jesus, it's going to be wood, hay, stubble, and it's going to burn. So what are we investing our life in that's going to last? And the only thing that really lasts is people, and the Word of God. So who's going to be in heaven because of you? And then it goes on, "Seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought ye to be, in all holiness and godliness, looking for and hastening unto the coming of the day of God, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we according to his promise look for a new heavens and a new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness. Wherefore, beloved, seeing that ye look for such things, be diligent, that ye may be found of him in peace, without spot and blameless." So that's what we need to do. As the world gets more and more chaotic, it's an election year, it's probably going to be pretty chaotic. Let's just keep our eyes on Jesus. And Jesus is the answer. There's a big skirmish going across. I think Jesus is the answer for both sides. And I wish that would be proclaimed. Keep in mind, forgiveness and redemption, this offer expires when you do. You realize that Jesus died for us. That's the key.